kids and also adults as well who are interruptive. Now, you might be listening to some of these things and think, I don't really feel like that applies to me, and that's okay, right? A lot of us, we learned right from wrong, and we tend to have the ability to curve it. We know, okay, if I choose to do this thing, it's going to get me in trouble. So for a long time, it is hard because it is an impulse. It's an impulse to want to talk. It's an impulse to want to interrupt. But that doesn't mean that we don't figure out how to assimilate, into everyday life to be able to have jobs. So it's really interesting because neurodivergence is a spectrum.
Welcome to Mild Moodcast, a podcast meant to explore mental health through the lens of another human hanging on by a thread. I'm Bianca, a registered mental health counselor intern, soon to be LMHC, here to chat about the topics we don't get enough of. So grab your headphones and let's dive into the crazy world of mental health. It's going to be a wild ride.
Whoa. Hello and welcome to my very first episode of Mild Moodcast. As you saw in the title, this is called I Am Not Mindless, Lazy, or a Born Procrastinator. I have ADHD. Shout out to my cousin for giving me the name of this episode because quite frankly, I wasn't sure what to call it until I saw her comment. So thank you very much. If you're listening, you know indeed who you are. So in today's episode, we're going to talk a lot about what ADHD is and why do I keep hearing about it. Before I jump into this topic, I just want to make a disclaimer to all of my viewers, all of my listeners. Please don't self-diagnose. If the symptoms that I talk about today sound like you, then maybe it's time to hit up your local professional. I'm glad that you're here. I'm glad that you're listening. And again, if it sounds like you, reach out to someone. So starting with what ADHD is, I figured it was a great place to kind of come into because a lot of times we hear about it, but we don't exactly know what it is, right? ADHD is technically a disorder that affects a person's ability to pay attention and control impulsive behaviors. So they place it in two categories, right? Inattention versus hyperactivity, impulsivity. So if we take a look at inattention first, we try to figure out what does that look like. Inattention is having difficulty staying focused. Now stick with me because I know right now it sounds really sciencey, and I promise not 100% of this is going to sound that way. But again, we need the background to figure out what's going on. So having difficulty staying focused, it's a fact that there are a lot of things that are not fun, but are important. And when they're not fun, but they're important, it's harder to stay on top of doing them. That can look like homework, that can look like studying, paying bills, any paperwork that you have to do, right? But the second that something is fun but not important, it's hella easy. I can jump on TikTok, I can do phone games, Candy Crush all day, right? Instagram, Facebook, anything that's going to give us little dopamine hits. Dopamine hits are basically moments of instant gratification. If I have that instant gratification, I could be there all day. So there's a big difference between things that are important and not fun and not important, right? But how do we figure out how to be able to do those things that are important but not fun? Throughout this series, we'll get into that for sure. We'll get into some specific topics regarding it and how to combat it as well. So if that's something that's relatable to you, keep listening. You might experience forgetfulness. You might mess up small details. I remember when I was in college, I could take tests, and as soon as I would read a part of it, I'd see an answer, and I'd be like, yeah, that's the one. And of course, I would get it wrong because I'm rushing, right? So I'd go back to the question, I'd look at it later, and I'd be like, wow, this was a really stupid mistake. Little things, right? Again, small details. Disorganization. Or are you the kind of person that when your partner asks you, hey, do you know where this piece of paper is? You'd be like, yeah, it's over there by the dining room table on top of the speaker, but under a box, second thing. You might just have ADHD. Being disorganized, is a certain part of it, but a lot of times we feel like it's organized chaos, like we're really, specific. So there are a lot of ways and there are a lot of symptoms. All in all, ADHD has 18 symptoms. Now, I'm not going to go through all 18, right? Because we're not trying to diagnose you. I just want this to be relatable and informative enough to help you, whether it's something that you're struggling with, someone that you know is struggling with it, or, either way, maybe it's both, right? So beyond that, now that we have a good idea of what inattention looks like, let's talk about hyperactivity. Of course, when you think of hyperactivity, you kind of think of the bouncy kids. There's a really big difference between the people who and the kids who cannot stop moving, right? Everybody thinks, oh, I don't have ADHD. I can sit down just fine. So hyperactivity, impulsivity might look like difficulty sitting still, for sure. Some people sometimes have to sit on their hands. I have a lot of clients who talked about that. When I was a kid, I had to sit on my hands. Otherwise, I could not stay still, Personally, I don't think I ever had that issue. I just kind of knew, hey, if I didn't sit still, I was going to get in trouble. So I had to figure it out. But, difficulty sitting still, fidgeting. If you're super talkative, hey, social butterflies, talking to you, because that was definitely me too. I was you could move me anywhere in a classroom and it didn't matter where the hell you set me. I was going to talk to whoever was next to me. Oh, look, I'm a therapist. Kids and also adults as well who are interruptive. Now, you might be listening to some of these things and think, I don't really feel like that applies to me, and that's okay, right? A lot of us, we learned right from wrong, and we tend to have the ability to curve it. We know, okay, if I choose to do this thing, it's going to get me in trouble. So for a long time, it is hard because it is an impulse. It's an impulse to want to talk. It's an impulse to want to interrupt. But that doesn't mean that we don't figure out how to assimilate, into everyday life to be able to have jobs. So it's really interesting because neurodivergence is a spectrum, right? Everybody thinks, oh, ADHD, you have to look one way, or not everybody, but a lot of people. And there's a lot of stigma around it, but it's not true. You can have the people who need to bounce from idea to idea to idea, or thing to thing to thing. And then you have the people who go on and they're bosses and they own companies and they take a completely different route. And sometimes you're sitting there at the age of 30, 31 in your 40s, and you're just now being diagnosed with ADHD because you didn't show any of the, hyperactivity, impulsivity that a lot of other people did in order to get that diagnosis earlier. So if you're like me and you got your diagnosis in your 30s, hi. It feels really good to be able to put a name to a thing, right? It's so weird because you live life just wondering, like, man, I am struggling with some of these things that other people don't have problems with, or if they have issues with them, damn, they're not saying anything. Oh, BT dubs, going off on a bit of a tangent here. I'm a therapist that curses, so a part of this podcast definitely will be me having some curse words here and there, but I try not to take over with it, right? So again, when we think of ADHD, a lot of times we think of the bouncy kids. We think of the ones that are super talkative. We think of the kids that it's just like, oof, I can look at you and I can know that you have it, right? But that's not all of us. Not everybody identifies in that way. But also with all of that comes the stigma, right? They tell us that we're lazy. They tell us that we're liars. They tell us that we make excuses or we procrastinate. And really, it's because we've spent so much of our life trying to be like everyone else. And that sucks, right? Because essentially, we've been working against our brain. And that stops here, genuinely. Working against your brain makes things so much worse. Well, why can't you just this? And how come they can that? I talk a lot about self-awareness in my sessions with my clients because self-awareness is such a bitch. We recognize the things that we should be doing, but then we spend more time focusing on those things instead of actually getting it done, right? We guilt ourselves. Why can't you just do X, Y, Z? And I spend more time focusing on why I can't do it than ways to actually get it done. So, even if you don't have an ADHD diagnosis, there are still things that could work for you because, again, neurodiversity is a spectrum. We are constantly sliding from side to side into different parts of the spectrum, right? And some days you might need certain things in some parts of life, whereas others you don't. And if know someone that has ADHD, we need to lead with curiosity and respect. That's first and foremost, right? So before I even get into supporting someone with ADHD, I do just want to cover why we hear about it so much. It is genuinely a cultural thing. So social media, obviously, like I mentioned earlier, if you have hit your 30s, your 40s, and you're just now getting your diagnosis, we're living in a social media world, right? So what do we want to do? We kind of just want to be able to share that with other people. So we're having these conversations, we're making these videos, and a lot of people, they want to make negative remarks about it. That's not ADHD, that's laziness. That's not ADHD, you're just saying that. And interestingly enough, I was listening to a training and it said that the East Coast of the United States is a lot more open about ADHD than the West Coast, with the exception of California. So we talk a lot more about it over here. And I'm not sure where you're listening from, but I am personally in Florida. And it has been something that has just shown up on TikTok, for instance, over and over and over again. But it's because we're finally entering a place where we're fighting back. We're telling people, hey, we're here and we're just trying to work with what we've got, right? So me hearing a lot about it, it's cultural. It really and truly is. And there are cultures out there in the world actually that will tell you, oh no, this child does not have ADHD because they don't believe that it's a thing. But then you come over, into another country, and not just the United States, because there's a lot of countries that will, be able to provide that diagnosis. But they come over to the United States, for instance, and they get told, no, hey, your kid needs a 504 or an IEP, something to be able to help them, right? So moving on, how can I support someone with ADHD? As I said before, you want to lead with curiosity. You want to lead with kindness. And you want to understand that because it's a spectrum, we don't need all 18 symptoms to fall somewhere on that spectrum. A lot of times people will meet with a therapist and they'll say, well, I don't really think that you have this diagnosis. But again, as I said earlier, that doesn't mean that there aren't things that you can do that will still help you, right? And one other thing that I heard that was really cool is the question isn't, do you want to change your brain? Because our brain is always changing, right? The question is, do you want to be in charge of those changes? It involves a lot of practice. And I don't think people consider that enough. Sometimes we really feel helpless when you have a word like disorder, knowing that ADHD is a processing disorder, right? But you have the word disorder, there's that self-awareness again. Oh man, I have a disorder. Oh man, I got to focus on the negative, right? But kind of just, we're trying to change the narrative here on things like that. So I very regularly tell my clients that we go through stages when we want to make change. And I think it puts it in really good perspective, even specifically talking about ADHD. So what do you mean, Bianca, that we go through stages? I'm so glad you asked, because I was going to explain it anyway. Things can be as small as deciding to play an instrument, and they can be as large as making the decision to go to therapy. So I actually have this graphic that I'm referencing right now. I don't know who created it. I don't even remember where I saw it, but it was tremendous for me and it really, really stuck. And I hope that it sticks with you. When we make a decision to do something, to make a change, it starts as an intention. Now, if you're my client listening to this right now, you have likely heard this come out of my mouth before, and it's the truth. And again, it's as small as learning an instrument and as large as going to therapy. So first and foremost, we have an intention. We have this idea that something's got to give, right? Something's got to give, something's got to change. I need to be able to do this thing. Maybe it's a diet. I have the idea. So after it's an intention, it's an action. So now I've decided to go to therapy and I've found myself a therapist, right? Then it becomes a practice. So I'm in therapy. I'm telling them everything I'm experiencing. They're giving me some things to work on. Or I started my diet. I regularly go to the grocery store. I get the things that I need and I'm starting to eat better. Or I picked up my instrument, whatever it is that it looks like. You get the point. I'm not going to beat a dead horse. But after it's a practice, it becomes a consistency, right? And after it becomes a consistency, it's a habit. And after it's a habit, beautifully, it's simply who you are. And I think that it's so important to point that out because nothing happens without practice, right? If I decide to pick up a bike, I'm going to fall. I don't think I know a single person who's ever picked up a bike and just gone straight away. And you know what? If you have, congratulations, you are the 1% of the population because the rest of us had to try and try again. And ADHD is that same way. If I am going to help play the role of creating change with my brain, being in charge of it, I have to know that I'm going to go through these 6 stages. It's going to be an intention. It's going to be an action, a practice, a consistency, a habit. And then it's simply who you are. But I also recognize that I'm kind of going to weave in and out of these. Some days it's a habit and then it drops down to a consistency. What if I started going to the gym, and I've gone for 30 days in a row, but on day 31, I wake up with the worst fucking cold. I wake up with the worst cold and now I don't want to go to the gym, right? Well, one day turns into 2 days turns into 2 weeks. And oh my gosh, I'm back at the point where it's an intention because I'm telling myself, oh shoot, we dropped the ball. I've got to get back into the gym. And for some people, they fall off there because they're so stuck in their head about the things that they can't control. And that's a whole other conversation. So we'll definitely get into that. But also, if you're on a diet and you decide to eat a piece of pizza doesn't ruin a diet, right? But a lot of times people will mentally take that piece of pizza and just say, I've done it, I've wrecked it, I quit. Rather than recognizing, hey, I'm allowed to slide in and out of these stages. And then I bump myself back up to a consistency because I ate that piece of pizza, but damn it, I deserved it. But I know that I'm going to do better every other time, right? And I think a lot of people just forget that, like anything in life, we had to learn how to do it. And that also includes when your brain is not wired in the same way that everybody else's is, for lack of a better way to put that. But, there's a percentage of us who really get down on ourselves for having a disorder. And I just hope that this is able to kind of give you some comfort. We all need to practice. We all have to figure out who we are. And just when you think you do, hell, there's more room to grow. And I think that that's the beauty. So I hope that this was a really good place to start today, just to open up the conversation, about what ADHD is, kind of what it looks like, how to support someone who has ADHD, and also the stigma that we hear. Don't let it get you down. There are always going to be naysayers, but ultimately it's only you that's living your life. It's not them. And then when they start to see the way that it works for you, what tends to happen to naysayers? Oh, you were right. Oh, you're doing it. Like, yeah, thanks. I know. I did it. I worked hard for it. So is it easy? No. But is it possible? Hell yeah, it's possible. And if you want to know some ways to deal with it and want to stay in for the conversation, I'd be happy to provide that for you. Thanks for listening, guys.
Thanks for tuning in to Mild Moodcast. Remember, the conversation doesn't end here. If you have any burning questions or topics you'd like me to cover, don't hesitate to reach out. You can find me on YouTube at Mild Moodcast and Instagram at Mild Mood Therapy. Let's keep the conversation going and continue to explore the wonderful world of mental health together. Until next time, stay curious and keep smiling.